If I say gain structure or gain staging, I think a lot of people would fall asleep, thinking it's a very boring or complicated topic. But in this video, I want to show you that gain staging can be fun and creative and interesting. Gain staging is simply the process of getting the right gain structure. And what is a proper gain structure? It's about getting the correct input and correct output to minimize distortion and noise in any audio circuit. If you've ever tried playing with a guitar amplifier and you're pushing the input too hot and you bring down the output, what do you get? Distortion. And it's the same thing in any compressor or line amp. And if you bring the input down too low and you have to compensate by bringing up the output, you get noise and hiss. So as a mix engineer, understanding how to get the proper gain structure is really important, because your mixes will sound more open, more hi-fi, and better in general. But also understanding that breaking these rules can be super fun, because working with gain staging is just as much a tone-shaping tool as a compressor or an EQ. And to demonstrate this, I'm gonna use a really cool new plugin that just came out by Pulsar Modular called the P455 Sidecar. And it's an emulation of a real sidecar that belongs to a famous engineer called Mark Daniel Nelson. So for the rest of this video, I want to show you a little bit about what you can do with this plugin, but also what you can do with gain staging in general. But before we move on, I wanted to point out a few important things about gain structure and about this plugin too. Whenever I try to build a healthy gain structure, I always try to keep the input knob and the output fader around unity, around 0. Instead, I always try to make sure that the signal coming in is at the right level, so that you're pushing into the input stage with the right amount. And I only use the knobs and the fader as a way to compensate if I have to. However, having said that, whenever we play with gain staging and we purposely try to saturate the sound, then we can do whatever we like, because we're actually purposely trying to get away from a healthy gain structure. The most important tool that you have when working with gain staging is your meter. In this case, a really big fat VU meter that I really like. The white needle shows the input level and the red one the output. So you can compare all the time how you're affecting the sound. And if you press this button, the raw plus input, you will also be able to meter what's happening after your input knob, which is useful too. And also the VU meter on this plugin is calibrated to -18 dBFS. And that means if you're aiming for a clean sound, a good gain structure, then that's the level you want to aim for when you're pushing into your unit, around -18. Because then you know that you have a good input signal that is not too loud or too quiet. In this video, I won't go through the EQ and the compressor as such, but of course they also affect the overall gain structure. Both of them are made up of amplifiers, and both will change their tone depending on how much is pushed into them. They will affect what comes after them too. So in that way, it's all part of the same gain structure. But for the sake of this video and to keep it simple, today I'm going to be focusing on the input knob and the bias and the output fader. But of course, we could make it more complex too and bring in the EQ and compressor. But that will be for another future video. And this specific line amp, which is of course our focus point here, because that's where we get all the juice, the saturation. It's made up of a combination of transformers, tubes, and inductors. So when you push it, you get a subtle saturation and a tightening of the signal, and also a bit more depth. At least that's how I perceive it. And conversely, if you decrease the input knob, you get a more dynamic and airy and open sound, which makes sense. But what about the bias knob? Bias affects the way that the tube is calibrated. So the more you push the bias, the more saturation you get from the tube, the more color. So you can use the bias knob as a way to make the effect more, or by counteracting the saturation of the input knob. So you can play with them together. And another cool thing with this plugin that I forgot to mention is that if you hold the shift button as you crank the input up, the output fader will come down automatically. And that's really cool. So in that way, you can keep the overall level the same, but just changing the tone, because that's what we want, right? So for the rest of the video, I'm just going to play with these controls. And of course, these are very subtle changes. But if you have a good pair of headphones or speakers, you should be able to hear a difference when I push the input or play with the bias settings. I'm going to use this A-B button too, so that you can compare before and after all the time. it's really important to mention that all of these examples, of course, are really extreme. But if you back off and you use it sparingly, like in a very light way, gain staging can be used as a very creative tone shaping tool, as a way to get more harmonics and depth and warmth into your mixes. And a creative way of using this that I don't know if you have ever thought about is that you can do this dynamically through a mix. So you can have the verse cleaner, and as the chorus comes in, you get more oomph, more a little dirtier sound without anything changing in the volume. And to anyone who's still watching this video, I wanted to say thank you, and that you're part of a minority who watches videos until the end. And I wanted to reward you with a free 30-minute coaching session. So this is a great opportunity for you to ask anything you want about mixing, and we can have a fun, interesting conversation. If you want to claim your session, just click on the link below in the description. It'll take you to a page where you can put in your email address, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible.